Hi, good morning. Sean Griffin. It's Morning Cup of Context. And this morning I was reading in Exodus 21, and I thought it was interesting because I ran across the famous passage, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It gets so often misquoted. And I just thought we'd dig in a little bit to some of the context and let's see what that expression is actually talking about. Many times it can be taken wildly out of context. So Exodus 21, and let's start with verse 22 here. It says, "If men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury," meaning if the child dies, "then you shall appoint as penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise." This makes sense when you think about, if a woman is struck and she, the trauma causes her to induce labor early, nothing wrong with the child, there's still a penalty involved, right, for striking the woman, and the penalty is decided upon what the judge demands. But we know that there's not a penalty. That he's not going to get the death penalty for striking the woman because she didn't die, nor did the child die. So I love this verse that it leads into this famous expression, because a lot of folks overlook how this actually gives protective rights to the unborn child. So, what an amazing thing. God already built into his law and his word that type of protection for the woman and child. Now, therefore, it says if there is an injury where, unfortunately the trauma that caused the woman to give birth early and then the child did suffer death, then that's when the judge will decide life for life, right? So that, because essentially the guy who hit her ended up murdering the child, right? I'm not sure the technical legality of that, whether it's a degree of manslaughter or out and out murder, but according to the judge, and this is something a lot of people can take out of the context of this actual passage, is that back then they had a series of judges who mediated the law, and it was the whole point of being able to be wise and understand the law so you can mediate in fairness and to be a judge to make decisions. And I think it's important that people keep that in the context of this phrase. That there wasn't just the woman got struck, and so therefore the man then goes and strikes the wife of the guy who hit his wife, right? No, so that's not what that little idiom expression is talking about at all, and we're gonna expound upon that, right? So let's look in verse 26, and this is just, guys, this is something that this is a great example of these videos, this whole idea of keeping things in context. Sometimes there's bigger context, like in other videos we went and we go to other books and we find how it's talking about the same thing. Sometimes it's literally the immediate passages all around the one taken out of context, right? And which we'll just clarify and explain real quick. Verse 26 does that for us here. Exodus 21, 26 through 28. "If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth." Okay, I'm going to stop right there, because what did verse 25 just say? That's the famous passage, verse 24 and 25. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right? Wound for wound, bruise for bruise. But right here, the very next verse talks about an eye injury and a tooth injury, okay? And so if you've got a servant, and unfortunately the translation here uses the word slave, but they didn't own perpetual indefinite slaves. It was a servant process, and the beginning of Exodus 21 explains those rules about once they've served their time, they're allowed to go free. And just like here, they're allowed to go free, right? Because it's this is an idea of how he, if he's abusing, basically, this is protecting the servant from being abused from someone that's, a bad employer, so to speak. This is if he's being abused to where his eye is destroyed. I'm guessing he loses his sight, and he suddenly, his debt's paid. He can go free on account of that injury. So this is protection for the servant. Same thing with the tooth. But now here's the thing I want to draw attention to. If we're to take that eye for eye, tooth for tooth thing out of context and try to apply it in such a literal fashion away from the context of its explanation in the laws, then we would have, at this point, the guy who struck him and caused his eye to go blind, he would have to get struck and have his eye to be blind, right? But that's not what it's saying, all right? It's talking about fair compensation. That's the whole idea of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It's fair compensation, and according to what the judge decides. Now, there's always been the penalty of if a life is lost unjustly or taken unjustly, then someone else pays the penalty of death. That's that death penalty concept has always been in the laws, right, in the Torah. But this whole concept of this eye, and then that's why I included verse 28 as well, because this is just 3 passages down from eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right? And it even goes into what seems like a different subject, but it's talking about equity of compensation, okay? And this is the whole concept of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, is that according to what the judge decides, you will pay for the loss of what you've caused, whether it's just his time, his disability, or any trauma or fear, like we read in verse 22, right? But here in verse 28 it says, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall go unpunished. Okay, so an ox gores a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. So there we see death was involved, so another death was brought up. I get that. But at the same time, you don't go, the ox gored a woman to death. That doesn't mean, the husband of that woman can go and have the owner of the ox have his wife get gored to death either. Does that make sense? So it's not that literal type of unrealistic, mocking type of application that we see people who don't actually know the words in the book, right? And they mock the ideas of God's righteous laws. And they think that they're silly, they don't apply, and that it's unjust and it's cruel and all that stuff. No, there's an amazing amount of protection here. HR departments would actually agree with their policies, would agree with Exodus 21 and all the protections it gives for different people at different time. And all it's talking about from a judicial perspective, as far as what a judge decides, is about fair compensation for what's lost, damaged, hurt, or whatever. Okay. And so this is where I think we dig in. These are just the immediate surrounding verses around that famous statement. Okay, so essentially, obviously we don't want to, if you get poked in the eye, you don't want to go around poking anyone in the eye.
Wrestling is good. Who's your favorite wrestler?
Well, even though he was slightly discourteous to me recently, I'm gonna have to say Captain Insano.
Okay. I want you to do to Casey what Captain Insano does to the bad guy. Go.
He poked me in the eye. Captain Insano shows no mercy.
Right. So such a great movie. So yeah, I mean, it's when it says eye for eye, guys, it's talking about fair contribution, and that compensation, and that would be decided legally according to God's laws by a judge, right, and not just willy-nilly by the person who's been hurt or offended. Okay. So this is I just want to bring some clarity to that. I hope it helps this morning. If you like the video, just share, like, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's Kingdom in Context, and I appreciate everyone watching these, and I hope that helped. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day.